Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. I'm Gabriella Kennedy. I'm a partner at Mayer Brown, and I counsel lots of companies through their journey trying to figure out the emerging AI regulatory framework. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Lake and Seth, who have been on the stage already. You already know them, but I'm going to ask them in 5 seconds to give an introduction of themselves. We're on a time crunch here. Lake.
I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. I teach applied AI and also AI governance. I'm also founder of Sancus Ventures. We invested in AI startups.
Seth?
It's always a risk to ask people on stage to introduce themselves. Seth Dobrin. I'm one of the founding partners at One Infinity Ventures. It's a deep tech AI fund, early stage. We focus on AI safety and responsible AI as well. That's a cross-cutting part of our thesis, as well as Web3.
So we're privileged to have people here who are builders, investors, advisors. So you have 3 hats on. So we're going to switch these hats. We're going to do a magic show. With 3 hats on, how do you define responsible AI?
Yeah, so prior to being an investor, I've been in the AI space since the mid-90s, since graduate school. And so I've been doing this for a long time. And prior to starting the fund and having a consulting firm, Qantm AI, I was IBM's chief AI officer for 6 years. And so I was from the business side, one of the champions in the industry initially, so 8 years ago, for driving the whole theme of responsible AI. And when you think about how to define it, I think one of the most globally accepted ways to define it is looking at the OECD AI principles, which if you look at the world, more than 60%, countries representing more than 60% of GDP have adopted these principles. And so they look at things like accountability, transparency, what boils down to human agency, and things like that, so that people have ownership and rights surrounding AI. And I think that's really what's important. And as a fund, that's how we define it. That's how we measure it. And we're building a system that we're eventually going to open source to measure ourselves and measure our startups. And we will probably create a foundation where we will measure other venture funds.
That sounds very exciting. Like, any other angles to the definition? I like panels where people are controversial and they don't agree. So please feel free to disagree.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, there's so much talk about responsible AI, talking about AI for public good, or we're talking about AI safety, which is, in my perspective, is a QA process. When you already produce the AI, then you want to see whether it's going to create a harm. What is most important and difficult to do is AI alignment. What does it mean? It means how do we build AI from day one aligned with human value, which is very difficult. Number one, humans are not aligned to start with. And how do we really determine what kind of data we're collecting to train AI system to align with human value, and how do we really evaluation the model is really tricky.
Thank you. So we're at an abstract level now. We're looking at the definition, but let's bring it down and look at how companies are trying to deal with actually adopting responsible AI. And Seth, you mentioned your background with IBM and working with Fortune 500 companies. How do they deal with this desire, drive to be responsible vis-a-vis their AI adoption and deployment? So you could.
Yeah, I think there's 3 camps. There's companies that don't care. There's companies that give it lip service, and there's companies that actually embrace it. And let me start with the companies that embrace it and were early adopters. And so the 3 companies that were early adopters were IBM, Microsoft, and Salesforce. And these are case studies that the World Economic Forum did, and you can Google them, just WEF and those 3 companies. And these were really the 3 companies to set up robust governance structures that, if you look across the world at Fortune 500 companies that care, these are the model. One of these 3 or some combination of these 3 structures they use. And really, they focus around matrix-type structures where there's a governance board that lays out very well-defined rules and processes that are set up in a way that they're enabling and not roadblocks. And people always get scared when they hear the word governance. And if you set it up, and because they think it's going to be a roadblock, but if you set it up properly, it actually helps to accelerate innovation because the teams in these companies understand where they can innovate and where they can't. And it's a process of getting to yes and not a process of getting to no. And in the course of the 4 years that I was part of this, what we call our ethics board, which I don't like the term ethics because it's different depending on where you live, we said no to exactly one project. And that's it. The rest were, we got to yes.
So that's the view from the big companies. But what about startups and investors? And should they care about responsible AI? And what's the value that they would get from it?
I think before I get to the startup, I think the other thing is worth to mention. So in the private sector, we have large public companies, and we also have a startup ecosystem, but there's also public sector. Right, so public sector, in my as my teaching role at the CMU, I actually provide teaching courses to California State, UK government, and then we have frequent conversation with the OECD as well. So I think the reason that is really important is if you think a startup where it sits. So some of the startups are selling to private companies, and some are going through procurement process with the public sector clients. So California, for example, California have over 100 AI use cases, and from transportation to climate change to healthcare to social security. All these different sectors, there are a lot of significant government spending. To understand where the AI safety responsible AI guidelines or regulatory compliance requirement is really important for the startup. And not to mention, many startups now are operating in the sectors like healthcare and finance, when data privacy, cybersecurity, compliance, and AI bias, those are very, very important subjects. Coming from their customers, coming from the board of the customers, and those are signals we cannot ignore.
So what you're saying, it's a necessity,
and
it makes business sense.
And let's look at their customers, right? The customers are going after. In the U.S., financial services company, they have regulations. The U.S. government. Even now, there's regulations or requirements in parts of the government where they have to meet certain standards. In the EU, absolutely there are standards. In Asia, there are standards. The Singaporean government has defined standards. The Malaysian government has defined standards. The Chinese government has very well-defined standards that you have to adhere to sell to those entities. DBS Bank, HSBC, they have very well-defined standards that if you want them to be your customer, these are things, as a startup, maybe you don't have to meet today, but you have to have a roadmap to get to if you want them to be your customer.
Yeah, I think this is very realistic. So for example, if you think about the procurement process for large customers, all the leading tech companies, or Fortune 500 companies, P&G, so there is this tremendous need for them to have AI strategy and AI execution. The disconnect of AI strategy and execution is risk mitigation.
Yes.
So when I want to, let's say if I'm purchasing on a CIO, CEOs, instead of working with IBM or Microsoft, I want to work with startup. The key issue is that how do I know the risk is managed well? How do I know the data is secured? How do I know the algorithm is not biased and trigger significant legal issue? Risk for me.
Yeah, that's definitely my job. Yeah. So I see it on a day-to-day basis. Clients come and talk about it. So we've established that why it is important, why we care about this. But where are we with just generally adoption of responsible AI? What are the challenges and what are some of the gaps that you see already?
I think we're super early, and then I think it's also starting with number one, do you realize that it is important? And then you figure out how we're going to proceed. We're still in the stage one. Are we on the same page? It's really important. Because at startup or companies that we have revenue goals, we're surviving mode. Who cares about responsible AI at this point? I need to survive first, right? So that is the serious conversations that are we on the same page?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think we're early, and I think that's why it's important to have funds that prioritize responsible AI, AI safety, whatever you call it, because there's different types of startups. Some of them, their thesis or their main goal is AI safety or responsible AI or AI ethics, however they frame it up, and so they're focusing on that. Then there are startups that are developing really cool things, and they haven't thought about it. And as soon as you say something, they're like, oh my gosh, I haven't thought about that, right? I mean, there's one startup called Viox that we're going to invest in, and this guy's developing this incredible technology that you tell it what your problem is in natural language, and it creates algorithms on its own that a human would never think of. So completely new algorithms that outperform any algorithm that a human could think of. And I'm like, and it's a solo founder, and he uses AI to develop his own things. And I'm like, what are you going to do when these algorithms start creating other algorithms? And he's like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. And so now, he developed them in a way where they can't escape into the natural world, right? So he's off developing this super cool technology, and he just never thought about it, right? And so, you just have to focus these founders, and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about it.
Yeah. I think I'm taking a very practical approach when I think about this. I think I used to be a founder as well. I know what is day-to-day like for startup founders. To think about everything, to do everything is impossible. The good news is, though, is right now there are when we talk about infrastructure, the AI native infrastructure, there are a few very important modules, which is exactly what I'm investing at, is data infrastructure, compute infrastructure, orchestration, and AI governance. So when you have all this tool set for you, so for the startup, don't have to build everything from scratch. They don't have on a day to try to catch what the regulatory changes for healthcare, for California, for New York. You actually have some third party, almost like a vendor, doing all this benchmark preparation and supervision, and also making recommendations. Those are amazing tool set. And we're seeing more and more of this, particularly in, for example, some of the sectors in healthcare and finance. Alignment AI, for example, is one of the startups that we have back in the past that specifically focus on healthcare. And we see more and more, like Qantm AI, and a lot of those companies are out there.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too. We invest in similar areas, so we invest in those kind of similar areas. We frame them a little differently. And when my experience is when funds have kind of overlapping parts of their thesis, it's hard to get their startups to work together. What I'm finding is we connect the startups, and they actually work together, and they save each other a lot of money, and they save each other a lot of work that they would have repeated. And so having these kind of adjacent parts that build other components of the platform encourage them to develop safer and more responsible AI, but it also saves them money, so that as a VC and as an LP who invests in the fund, you get better returns, get them to profitability faster, and they also go in sometimes and work on customers together.
So I love it that you've already switched to your investor hat.
Of course we did.
So on that, obviously you're committed to responsible AI. How can you be effective? You've demonstrated that. But how do you see the red flags in the startups that might be the potential, targets for investment where they don't take AI seriously? How do you spot that, and what do you do about it?
So I think you can, it's part of the due diligence process, right? So you have a question. So what do you think about any AI application? You can ask the questions. Number one is where the data sits. How do you manage data? How do you protect data privacy? Number two, are you using open source? Are you using proprietary models? And then what do you do with the models? How do you benchmark it? And number three is something happened terribly wrong, what's the rollback process? So questions like that, and then you can clearly see whether those are the questions that have went through the brain and the founders, and sometimes they completely have a blank look. Then obviously doesn't mean that this is not happening now, but it's really good conversational pieces to talk to founders to realize how important it is. Again, I never want to say, here's something you have to do it, reinforce to that. But important is that, as we talked about earlier, how is it connected to the startup goal in terms of business goal, in terms of protecting yourself? So I can share 2 stories that the startup founders really fantastic and was able to generate tens of millions in a few months of launch. But because everything take off so quickly, he didn't really pay attention to data privacy, didn't really pay attention to all the algorithm, how it's actually potentially be harmful for teenagers, right? So as a result, as he continued to take off when line up with investors, and Apple decided to remove them from the Apple Store. So all of a sudden, the company basically went from, skyrocketing to everything to nothing. So those are kind of things that I think, if you, as a founder, think about early, and it will prevent you from getting into a situation like that.
Yeah, I mean, I do similar thing. We do similar thing. We ask questions. Like I said, we use OECD principles, and we evaluate. Well, we ask the startups to evaluate themselves against it. We evaluate the startups against them. We look for phrases that are red flags when we ask the questions. Things like, I don't know how this translates into Chinese for people in the audience, but like, yeah, but.
Yeah.
And we also, we record the conversations, and I have an AI system that we've built that kind of looks for those red flags in case we miss them as part of the deal memo sheet that we use, and so process that we use, and so we use AI a lot internally too, and so things like that. There are red flag phrases and words that we look for while we're having conversations with them when we're bringing up the whole AI safety, responsible AI conversation as part of our diligence, as part of our initial evaluation. And we usually pick this up early in the conversation. So we don't have pipeline, we have vetted deals. So when we talk to a startup, we have 2 conversations, and then we get rid of the startups that we're not interested after those first 2 conversations.
We only have less than 2 minutes, so in the last 2 minutes, I would like you to give advice to startups. If they want to attract your attention, what should they do as investors?
I think, this is going to be a little bit controversial. So
yes, please.
And I never think building a company is for investors. So you do what you think is the right thing to do, and that's your drive. And you invite the investors along with your value. So as an investor and former founder, I would say, at the end of the day, you are the one building the companies, not the investors. The whole fundraising environment is tough, but it's also the best time to build. Because I think in the next year or 2, you're going to see less noise in the market. The best time to attract talents.
Yeah, I mean, we look for, well, we're early stage, right? We do pre-seed, seed, and Series A. We look for passion, right? You have to be passionate, you have to be committed. You can't be swayed easily, but you need to be coachable at the same time. You need to be technology focused, but you need to be customer focused at the same time. And kind of dichotomy, but and I think I agree 100% with your controversial statement. I don't think it's that controversial, but I think those are really, really good things to focus on, and I think that, and you need to know what your blind spots are. I think that's really important.
So thank you very much, Lai and Seth. We've had very little time, but I think you whet the appetite of the audience on issues regarding responsible AI, and I'm sure they will reach out to you if they have questions. I'm so sorry we do not have time for questions, but thank you so much for being with us today.